Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the 2021 Spring Speaker Series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Delia. I am Achuda's personal assistant, and I will be filling in for him today because he is in the process of moving, changing houses, and he's unable to make it today. But he has said that he is looking forward to watching the recording. So I will be standing in his stead with hosting duties. So this is the first talk of the Spring Speaker Series. The Speaker Series, Nightlight Astrology hosts 12 talks every calendar year. 3 per zodiacal season. And the purpose of the speaker series is to make quality astrological education available to a broad audience. And also the purpose is to expose Achuda's students, the Nightlight students, to different topics that we don't necessarily cover in the course curriculums or different astrological points of views. So to that end, we are very happy to host a series of interesting guests every year. And this speaker series has been a long-standing tradition, but thanks to the success of the annual Kickstarter campaign and everybody who contributed to that, we are able to make these talks completely free and open to the public. And at the same time, we're able to pay our speakers a generous speaking fee that is above standard in the astrological community. So it's just a way to support the students. It's a way to support the astrological community and anybody who's interested in astrology at large. So before we get to today's talk, I would just like to share the lineup, the rest of the lineup for the Spring Speaker Series. Michelle, can you see the
Yeah, I can see
website?
it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so if you go to the website, nightlightastrology.com, events, speaker series, there you will find the lineup, the dates, and the links to register. As I mentioned, the talks are completely free, but you do need to register in order to attend live and receive your own personalized login link. So today we have Michelle Corbisier doing a talk on Rising from the Dead, the meaning of planets returning to visibility, and I'll talk a little bit more about that just in a second. Next weekend, on Saturday, we have Martine Hermes, who is going to be giving a talk on images, houses, and places. Martine Hermes gave a talk at Nightlight in the speaker series, I believe it was last year, on the lots, and he's an excellent scholar of Schmidt, one of the foundational thinkers in the Hellenistic revival. And he does a really good job explaining these concepts, the concepts in a way that's really easy to grasp. So you're not going to want to miss that one. And then next Sunday, you can find also the times, the dates and the times here, and the link to register. And next Sunday, Kat Nelligan will be giving a talk on discovering the personal daimon. Some of you might know Kat. She appears, she's a frequent guest on Achuda's YouTube channel, and she hosts her own website. And I know that this topic is one that she's very passionate about and interested in. So that's going to be a really great talk as well. You can register there. All of these talks will have a replay after they go live. There are several ways to view the replay. It'll be available on this same events page. The replay link goes up the day after the talk, not immediately after, because the video takes a little bit of time to process. But if you come on here tomorrow at some point, the register here link will be replaced by a replay link, and you'll be able to replay that talk for 7 days. Also, you should receive a replay link in your email. And all Nightlight students who are currently active in a course will receive the recording of these talks in your Dropbox. And that includes the year 2 and horary courses that just concluded. You will be receiving these talks in your Dropbox as well. So if you're an active student, you'll get the recording. If you are a general audience, you can watch the replay here or get the link in your inbox and it goes up the next day after the reading. So, yeah, so let me introduce Michelle Corbisier, who's personally a very dear friend of mine. So Michelle is an alumni, a very talented alumni of the Nightlight programs. And she's also part of the Nightlight team. She helps providing a lot of student support, and answering their questions, etc. And her talk is going to be on Helical Rising today. So I'll just read the description of today's talk. In this workshop, we will explore what it means for a planet to reappear over the horizon during twilight after a period of being hidden under the sun's beams. The symbolism of helically rising stars is fascinating, and this phenomenon was understood as a powerful omen by ancient astrologers. What is the significance of reemerging planets? What does it mean when they disappear again? And how could we use this information when interpreting a chart? We'll look at a range of examples where visibility is the central focus, and the purpose of this workshop is to familiarize astrologers with this concept in order to enable them to interpret those phenomena with more confidence. So that is what we will be viewing today. And you have a brief biography of Michelle here. And you can find more of her work, and you can also book a reading with her, etc., on her webpage, which is linked here at michellesmidheaven.com. So before I hand this over to Michelle, I would just like to explain a little bit of etiquette for this talk. We have received feedback in the past, just in general, that the chat box can be distracting for some people. And unfortunately, since Zoom hasn't yet implemented a way for it to be completely hidden on the user's end without notifications popping up, I will be hiding the chat box. However, you are still able to send me a personal message if you encounter any sort of technical problems. So I will go ahead and do that right now and set it to all panelists. So private messages to me. And question and answer will be saved until the end of this talk. If you go into your Zoom, if you look at your Zoom buttons, there is a button that says Q&A, and it has different chat box bubbles. So please type your questions there, and Michelle will address them at the end of her talk. So that's it for house cleaning. Without further ado, Michelle, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Delia, for that beautiful introduction. I'm going to share my screen here. Right, I hope you can see it.
We can see it, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Delia. Right, move this here. Well, hi everyone, and thank you for joining me here today on Easter Day. So happy Easter to everyone who is celebrating. Happy Sunday. I feel very fortunate and grateful for being here, so thank you. And all right, so the title of my talk is Rising from the Dead, and this refers to planets that are returning to visibility. And ancient astrologers saw these planets as being reborn after they have encountered the sun. But first of all, I'll show you how I structured this presentation. I'm going to talk a little about visibility and vision, a brief philosophical background before taking a look at what is actually happening in the sky when a planet returns to visibility. And then I want to gradually translate the sky to the chart with a step-by-step guide that I've put together. And of course, I'll talk about how to interpret planets that return to visibility. And also, I added a mystical moment. Finally, we're going to take a look at a bunch of example charts. And so there's a technical part on the one hand, but there's also a mystical part that I'll gradually explore, especially around Venus and Mercury. So whenever a planet is coming closer to the sun, it becomes invisible for us because that planet is, the light of the planet is overpowered by the blinding light of the sun. And for ancient astrologers, that would symbolize an old planet in the last steps of its cycle. The planet is dying, and when it encounters the sun, it will become revitalized and reborn. And as I will try to show you later in the talk, in some cases they can be seen as resurrected. This rebirth is what is symbolized by a planet coming out of the blinding rays of the sun, a planet becoming visible again. And in astronomy, this process is called Helical Rising. The word helios means sun, so Helical Rising simply means rising from the sun. And this phenomenon also includes any fixed stars that become visible again after a period of lying hidden. And the Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, and Greeks all used the helical risings of various stars for the timing of agricultural activities. And they based their calendar on the risings and settings. However, I'm only going to talk about the helical rising phases of the planets today. And this is a specific planetary phase in the synodic cycle. And with synodic cycle, I mean the movement of a planet in relation to the sun. The word synodic is derived from the Greek word synodos that translates as assembly or meeting or union. And this cycle consists of different phases. The different positions of a planet relative to the sun will change the planetary speed, the direction, and the visibility, and this will in turn affect the planet's condition, and as a result, of course, our interpretation of the planet. And the synodic cycle starts with the union or the conjunction of the planet and the sun. And then the planet goes on through a number of different phases to complete its cycle when it joins the sun again. And these planetary phases can be thought of as a reflection of the relationship between the sun and the moon, between the king and the queen of the sky. The planetary cycle can be seen as a repeating of the lunar cycle, although the actual synodos or union between sun and moon is very special in itself and can be seen more like a marriage, while the union between the sun and a planet signifies the death and rebirth of that planet. And the increase and decrease of the reflected light is what matters most here. And so it is the sun that determines the planetary phases. Planets also become brighter and darker. And it's very easy for us to see the lunar phases. We can simply see the moon gaining light and losing light. The phases are perfectly visible because the moon is so big. It's less easy to see the crescent reflection of the sun on the surface of Venus, at least with the naked eye. And we can easily trace the lunar cycle from the new moon phase that starts with the conjunction of the moon and the sun, with the waxing crescent when the moon reappears in the western sky after the sun has just set, and then it will be gaining light until it makes a 90-degree square. That's the first quarter phase, reflecting more and more light as it trines the sun until it opposes the sun, and that's when we see the full moon. And after that, the moon is waning, gradually losing light again, going to the third quarter phase when only the left side of the moon is reflecting the light of the sun. That's the third quarter moon, or the last quarter moon, when the moon is in its second 90-degree angle with the sun. Then darkness takes over, and the moon will become darker and darker while getting closer to the sun until it reunites once again with the sun. And every single phase of this cycle is very important, and the planetary phases are similarly important. The conjunction between a planet and the sun is equivalent to the new moon phase. And as I said, it's not easy to detect the equivalent of the first quarter moon on one of the planets with the naked eye, but there are a few phases that are very noticeable, such as the phase I'm going to talk about today. When a planet comes out from under the beams of the sun, it is going to become briefly visible for us on the horizon. And this will be the moment of first visibility, as we call it. Just like the new moon is young, signifying a new beginning after her union with the sun, the planet that comes out from under the beams of the sun is a young planet, a reborn planet. And this is an important moment in a planet's cycle, but unfortunately, the Helical Rising phase is mostly forgotten or ignored by the modern revival of Western astrology. And I think that for us astrologers, or even for a romantic stargazer, this phenomenon of helical rising, or first visibility, the reappearance of that wandering star that has been invisible for quite some time, that can invoke a certain experience, a spiritual experience, when you feel or when you just know that what you see is meaningful, and that this re-emerging star in the sky is a sign, an omen. It's an omen that only you can fully grasp right then and there in that moment. The omen speaks to you. And as Robert Schmidt pointed out, an omen is an appearance that speaks. And for astrologers, it's the visibility is the phenomena in the sky that we can see with the naked eye from our point of view here on Earth. That is a geocentric perspective that is important. It is a heavenly writing that speaks to the astrologer who participates actively through studying this divine living language. Khalil Gibran once wrote that the trees are poems that the earth writes upon the sky. And I think that the stars are poems that the sky writes for those on earth. I want to talk a little about the significance of visibility. The ancient Greeks had an amazingly interesting theory about vision, which I find so fascinating. Empedocles, who was a Greek philosopher who lived in the 5th century BC, thought that everything was composed of the 4 elements: fire, earth, water, and air. And he said that Aphrodite, or Venus, made the human eye out of the 4 elements, and that Venus then lit the fire in the eye, which would then shine from the eye, making it able to see. And this theory was also held by Plato, by the way. Of course, in that case, we should be able to see very clearly during the night as well, but Empedocles had a solution to this. He thought that there was an interaction between the rays coming from the eyes and the rays coming from a source such as the sun. And it is the thought of this interaction that I find so fascinating and so symbolic and inspiring. So Empedocles said that we see objects because light streams out of our eyes and touches the objects. So the eye was more like skin that was skin that was seeing and sensing. And this thought of the fire of the eyes touching the objects they're looking at reminds me of something. And I'm sure many of you had the experience where you're sitting somewhere on a bus or something and you notice this feeling that there's someone behind you or staring at you. And it feels really uncomfortable. And then you turn around and you see that there's actually someone staring at you. It really does feel like their gaze is touching you in some mysterious way. The things that we see also touch us. The elements in the things outside of us are perceived by the corresponding elements within ourselves. So for the Greeks, knowledge is the ancient Greeks, I should say, knowledge is the correspondence of something outside of you with something within you. Something outside of you can awaken something in yourself that was hidden from sight. And looking at something can make you remember. So you can say, oh, I see, when we suddenly understand something. And what we see is the connection, the sameness that exists with what is within us and what is out there, as within, so without. And I feel that something similar is happening when I'm reading a chart. So to me, this is such a valuable theory. And of course, it's not scientific nowadays, but it feels like it comes a lot closer to my experience, because I don't experience my eyes retina receiving two images that are mixed and turned upside down in my brain. I do, however, experience that someone is able to touch me with their eyes. And the same goes for eye gazing. I'm sure most of you have heard about this technique where you have to sit still and gaze deeply into your partner's eyes for a while. It doesn't even have to be your partner, it can be a stranger. And this is a well-known practice that is used in the Hindu, Sufi, the Buddhist, and the Tantra philosophies. And it's said to be one of the paths to enlightenment. And I keep going on about this just to make sure that you all know that vision, watching, visibility is something that shouldn't be taken for granted. Watching the stars actually does something to you, and looking at a horoscope wheel also does something to you. In Hellenistic astrology, aspects have to do with visibility. The planets see each other. The planets in the horoscope are witnesses, and they bring testimonies through aspects. And Robert Schmidt clarified that the language that is used in the Hellenistic source text uses a legal analogy, as if the horoscope is a courtroom and the planets are thought of as bearing witness to your karma. And I think that the witnessing is also something that we do as human beings when we realize through some forms of meditation, for example, that we actually are witnessing our own lives instead of being this or that, instead of identifying with who we think we are in this life. We are witnessing. And as astrologers, we look at a natal chart or another chart and try to figure everything out with the mind, but oftentimes it feels like there is much more to it. And you can feel that you're bearing witness to something greater. And you all have to, you have to know a bunch of techniques first. And after a while, something interesting starts happening. And instead of having to struggle to figure things out, you suddenly see a pattern or a theme, or you even see a certain event happening in the chart. And to me personally, that translates to seeing an omen in the horoscope. So my point is that a natal chart itself can become the appearance that speaks through the use of certain techniques. We can see omens in the chart just like we can see omens anywhere. And it is something, is something outside of you corresponding with something inside of you. When you see an omen, you just know what it means, and it's always about something that you've been pondering, or it's right when you say something or think about something that the omen appears, and you know it has something to do with what you were just thinking about. And this is what happens sometimes when you're studying a chart as an astrologer. The astrological techniques are the grammar of a divinatory language. But as we very well know, there is more to language than just grammar or vocabulary. So there is much more to astrology than just the techniques, is what I'm saying. Right, I could go on about this, but my point is that we do not need to know whether the planet we're looking at in the chart was actually really visible on the day of birth, if it didn't disappear behind a mountain or something. The chart in itself will be the appearance that speaks to us. The chart itself will become the omen, in addition to being a representation of what is happening in the sky. So before you can let the chart speak to you, however, you need to have a good grasp of the techniques and how the chart works, and really understand that the chart is a moment in time. But you should also be able to see some of the past and the future in the chart, where the planets come from and where they are heading. Is a planet just about to set under the beams of the sun, or is it coming out of the sunbeams? So there's an important difference in interpretation. And in this image here, you can see 3 planets that have recently escaped the beams of the sun: Mercury, Jupiter, and Saturn, and they're briefly visible on the eastern horizon just before sunrise. This is what happened in February of this year, by the way, and I've added the chart for this day as well. And these 3 planets here are all rising from under the beams of the sun. And I want to stress that not all of the planets that you can see in the morning are in their actual helical rising phase. That's important. Some might be on their way back into the sunbeams. So visibility is not the same thing as first visibility. When I say first visibility, I am talking specifically about a planet that just reemerged from the beams of the sun after its lying hidden phase. So planets that are visible in the morning or in the evening are said to be of the morning or of the evening, respectively, but they're not necessarily re-emerging from the sunbeams. We need to see this distinction in the chart. So I want to walk you through a step-by-step guide that hopefully will be helpful for some of you. And I do realize that this is something that may be obvious to some of you, but to those who have some trouble with spatial orientation, it can be really hard. And I get a lot of questions from students about this. So let's move on. Yeah, how do we translate the sky to the horoscope wheel? So first of all, horoscope wheels look different in every software program, and this can be disorienting by itself. I use SolarFire, and all of the examples that I present today are done in the whole sign house system. Of course, what I'm about to say also applies to any house system that you might prefer to use. It doesn't matter. What is important to know is that you understand how the wheel represents the sky and where the horizon line is, for example. And the horizon is always the straight line from the degree of the ascendant to the degree of the descendant. The ascendant is the exact degree where the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun, intersects the horizon. That's the ascendant. It's not always the first house cusp. In quadrant-based house systems, the first house cusp will be defined by the degree of the ascendant, but here in the whole sign house system, where the first house is always equal to the first sign, we have to look at the specific degree of the ascendant, and the ascendant is always going to be floating somewhere in the first house. Like in this example, it's at 8.5 degrees of Virgo. And as daytime goes on, this degree marker is going to move down through the first sign until it reaches the sign of Libra, and then the wheel will switch to a first house Libra. Why is that? Well, this happens because of the primary motion that carries the whole sky from left to right. Because of the Earth's rotation, it's spinning around its own axis. All the planets and stars, the sun and the moon, all the celestial bodies appear to be carried from the east up high in the south, where they culminate, and then they move downwards again until they set in the west and disappear from our sight. So if you have the sun here in Gemini, and it's probably close to the midheaven here, which is at its highest point in the south. So this horoscope wheel is a daytime chart with the sun culminating in the 10th house around midday. And as the hours pass, the sign of Gemini will move further towards the descendant, taking the sun, who will then hit the descendant degree, which is always in the 7th house. Here is where the sun will set in the 7th house and become invisible. So the primary motion is in the chart is just the daily motion of the planets along the ecliptic from east to west. Now, while we see the planets rise, culminate, and set every day, simultaneously, the planets are also moving very slowly in the other direction. That is the secondary motion. The planets move in a counterclockwise direction against the background of the zodiac. So for example, today Mercury has ingressed into Aries, and it's going to stay there, making its way through the sign of Aries in a counterclockwise direction until it ingresses into Taurus. And that is going to fly by, actually. Mercury is going to fly through 30 degrees in 2 weeks. So this means that Mercury is moving twice as fast as the sun, because the sun moves 1 degree forward every day. These two motions are important to keep in mind because they're going to help you to see where the planets are going and what planetary phase they're in. And in this case, we want to know about one specific planetary phase, the phase of first visibility, or the helical rising phase. And we're going to need to know whether a planet is coming out of the beams or moving into the beams of the sun. So here, can you spot which planets are coming out from under the beams? You see the sun here with Mars on the left of the sun and Mercury on the right. Is it Mars that is coming out from under the beams, or is it Mercury? Or is it both, or neither of them? How about this one? The sun is at the midheaven and Venus and Mercury are on the left of the sun. Are they rising from the beams of the sun or not? Or this last one here, is Mercury helically rising or not? We'll revisit these charts later. How to identify this more easily in the chart? We have to consider 3 steps to find out. That is the direction of the planet, the speed of the planet, and its position relative to the sun. This is what we need to know in order to see which phase the planet is currently in. We'll start with the direction of the planets. Here we see the secondary motion again, indicated by these arrows pointing in a counterclockwise direction. So these arrows represent the slow planetary movement through the zodiac, from Aries to Taurus to Gemini to Cancer to Leo and so on. So generally, the planets move in this counterclockwise direction, but sometimes they slow down and they appear to be standing still in the sky. And that's when we see the planet at the same spot every night at the same time for several nights in a row. That's when they're stationing. And after a stationing period, the planet appears to be moving backwards in the sky, backwards through the degrees of the zodiac, as if the planet is slowly retracing its steps. And this is the retrograde motion of the planet. Of course, the sun and the moon will always move forward through the zodiac. They're always direct. They're always going in a counterclockwise motion. And the other planets will all become retrograde at certain stages in their cycles. And it's good to know that Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars are always direct in motion when they are closer to the sun. So Mercury and Venus can be direct or retrograde in close proximity to the sun. Mercury and Venus make two kinds of conjunctions with the sun. One where they're direct in motion, so moving forward in the zodiac, and another conjunction when they're retrograde or retracing their steps. Fortunately for us, every ephemeris or every software program simply shows us if a planet is stationing or retrograde, and we will have to check whether Mercury or Venus will turn direct or retrograde after their stationing phase. Now, the second thing we need to consider is the speed of the planet, the speed relative to the sun. Is the planet moving faster or slower than the sun? In most textbooks where the planetary phases are explained, they start with the distinction between inferior and superior planets. And we see that this distinction is made in the Chaldean order of the planets. The Chaldean order is an arrangement of the planets according to their relative speeds as seen from Earth. So they're arranged from the slowest to the fastest planet. So we have Saturn as the slowest planet, then Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and finally the Moon. And Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars are the superior planets, while Venus and Mercury and the Moon are the inferior planets. And textbooks make this distinction because there are important differences between the synodic cycles of the superior and inferior planets. But I won't go into detail about every single step of the synodic cycles because that would take me too long. But for the purpose of this talk today, this model can help us to remember that the superior planets are always going to be moving slower than the sun. So that's easy enough. We don't have to worry about them. Now we know that the sun will always catch up with the superior planets and not the other way around. We don't have to worry about the moon either. The moon is always much faster than the sun. So the moon is always going to catch up with the sun, not the other way around. So the only planets that we have to pay close attention to are these two inferior planets, Mercury and Venus. And it's not enough to look at the average speed of Mercury and Venus, which is a little under a degree a day. We have to make sure that we know their actual speed. Mercury and Venus sometimes move slower than the sun when they're retrograde or about to station. While Mercury at its greatest velocity, Mercury moves twice as fast as the sun. So if you're not familiar enough with the synodic cycle yet, you should definitely check your ephemeris to calculate how fast the planet is actually moving on the particular day of the chart, or you can actually animate the chart in some software programs and get a visual representation of the speed of the planet. We not only need to know the actual speed at the moment, but also if they're picking up speed or not. So only for Mercury and Venus, we have to make sure if they're in the process of becoming faster or slower. And you'll be able to guesstimate whether they are slower or faster than the sun when you get a better understanding of their planetary phases. But for now, it should be enough to know that Venus and Mercury always slow down when they're moving too far away from the sun. They slow down, the sun catches up with them again until the distance from the sun is great enough to make the planets turn direct again. Okay, this brings me to my final point, and that is the position relative to the sun. And first, we need to know about the distance. How far away from the sun does a planet have to be to become visible again? So most texts will say 15 degrees or between 12 and 15 degrees, or sometimes even 17 degrees. And we have to look for planets that are about 15 degrees away from the sun. And we always have to check if a planet reaches this 15-degree mark within 7 days of the native's birth. This is 7 days before and 7 days after birth. You'll find that the actual true helical rising happens at various distances from the sun, but ancient astrologers standardized this distance to 15 degrees. Let's keep in mind that we're looking for an omen in the chart, a planet that is drawing our attention. And so please don't apply this rule too strictly, but the planet should reach that standardized distance of 15 degrees sometime during this period of 14 days, that is 7 days before, 7 days after birth. Okay, now let's put all of this into practice. So we've spotted a planet in a chart that is about 15 degrees away from the sun. We found out what the planet's direction is, what its speed is, and now we have to look whether the planet is on the left or on the right of the sun. And I'm going to talk a little about the phenomenon of first visibility. I just wanted to include that so that when you're looking at a chart, you'd have an idea of where the helical rising planet would have been visible on the day of birth or within 7 days after birth. And in some cases, it will have some impact on the interpretation as well, and I'll come back to that later. On the left or the right of the sun, that's easy enough. This is the third and last consideration. The planet's position will then tell us whether the planet has just encountered the sun or if the planet is about to encounter the sun. So planets that are re-emerging from the rays of the sun are either on the left or on the right from the sun, remember at about a distance of 15 degrees. So these planets are invisible during the day because of the sunlight, obviously. They're invisible at night because they're under the horizon with the sun. So they're either visible in the early morning or in the evening. What is the easiest way to see this? Well, imagine yourself standing in the middle of the circle looking at the sun. The planets on the right of the sun will be of the morning because they will be visible in the early morning right before the sun rises, just for a brief while before the daylight takes over. This is the moment of what is called first visibility. And in the textbooks, you'll see that the planets on the right side of the sun are referred to as matutine, which means of the morning. And another name you'll frequently see is oriental, from Orient or East, and they rise in the East before sunrise. So we'll see that the planets that first become visible again as a morning star are always the slower ones, the slower planets. And with slower planets, I mean, of course, that the planets are effectively slower than the sun at this point. So that's not only the superior planets, but also the inferior planets that are slowed down because of their retrograde motion. So the sun will move forward counterclockwise in the zodiacal order catching up with any planet that is slower than itself. So here the sun is just rising in this photo, but right before dawn, we could have seen a helical rising planet here. And remember, not all planets you see in the east before dawn will be in their helical rising phase, only the ones that are slower than the sun. And here we have a chart example of this situation. And remember, we're checking direction, speed, and the position relative to the sun. And in this example, Mars is moving in a direct motion because superior planets are always direct in proximity to the sun. So Mars is going from 2° Capricorn towards 3° Capricorn. Step 2 is the speed. Mars is a superior planet, is always moving slower, so they're both direct, and the sun is faster. How about position? If we stand here in the center of the wheel and we look at the sun, we see that Mars is on the right side of the sun. This means that the sun has already passed Mars. And in this case, Mars is helically rising and will be visible in the morning on the eastern horizon. Mars is now a morning star. And I've added a chart for the morning of that same day just to illustrate this first visibility moment. So here you see Mars in the first house above the ascendant-descendant axis. So Mars is just above the horizon while the sun is still under the degree of the ascendant. Mars is in its first visibility phase here. Notice that Mercury, Venus, and the moon are also visible that morning, but they're not in their first visibility or helical rising phase. Why? Because all three of them are faster than the sun, which means that in this case, they are moving closer and closer towards the sun. So they are in fact setting into the beams of the sun where they will become invisible. Now, planets on the left of the sun will be of the evening, and because they're becoming visible just above the western horizon after the sun sets. And very soon after, they will set in the west as well through primary motion. Yeah, I should add that, of course, on this slide, you wouldn't be able to see anything because there's a church and there are mountains, but you get the idea. You also see terms like vespertine planets or occidental planets in the textbooks. That just means that they're on the left of the sun when you imagine yourself standing in the center of the wheel looking at the sun. So in the evening, when you see some stars or planets above the western horizon just after sunset, only the planets that are moving faster than the sun will be the ones that are coming out from under the beams of the sun. The faster planets can only be the inferior planets, Mercury and Venus. And of course, like I mentioned in the very beginning, the new moon always has first visibility in the west. The sun's light is then reflected on the right side of the waxing crescent moon. Let's look at a chart example. Here our attention is drawn to Venus because there is a distance from 15 degrees, 15 degrees between Venus and the sun. So again, let's follow our 3 steps. First, the direction. Venus is direct here, so it's following the zodiacal order, going from 16 degrees Gemini to 17 degrees Gemini. And remember, if you're not familiar with the synodical cycle yet, it's best to check Mercury's and Venus's speed in an ephemeris. Step 2, we've checked Venus's speed in our ephemeris, and Venus is moving faster than the sun. Now we know that the conjunction between these two has already happened and that Venus is separating from the sun. So Venus is coming out from under the beams of the sun. And if you're looking at a chart and the sun and Venus are not conveniently placed at the descendant, how will you know where Venus will reappear after its period of invisibility? We find out by looking at its position, which is step 3. We'll look at the sun from the center of the circle. Venus is on the left of the sun, and planets on the left of the sun will become visible after the sun has set. So this would be at the descendant. And here it is later in the evening on that same day, we see Venus still above the horizon, while the sun has already set and it is now below the horizon, or the ascendant-descendant axis. Why is it important where the first visibility will occur? Well, both Mercury and Venus can have their helical rising and setting phases on the western horizon as well as on the eastern horizon. And you not only have to find out which is which, but it will also change their signification a little bit. More about that when we get to the interpretation. Yeah, as a last example, before we get into the interpretation of these phenomena, here is a Mercury that is stationing direct after its retrograde period. Of the inferior planets, Venus will always be retrograde when it has first visibility on the eastern horizon, and Mercury will mostly be stationing right on that 15-degree mark. It will always appear to be standing still while the sun moves away from it. So this example here shows that what will appear in the sky in June of this year, Mercury will turn direct on the 16th degree of Gemini and will move forwards through the zodiac again soon to 17 degrees Gemini and so on. But it's still going to be very, very slow for a number of days, much slower than the sun. So the sun is the fastest here and has already entered the sign Cancer. So it has already encountered Mercury while Mercury was still retrograde, and the sun is now separating from Mercury, leaving a distance of almost 15 degrees between them. Mercury will then reappear briefly as a morning star before dawn. And now we can revisit these charts that I showed in the beginning, and you should be able to see now which planets are returning to visibility. Both Mars and Mercury here are worth paying attention to just because they're close to being about 15 degrees away from the sun. So let's start with Mars first. Mars is a superior planet, and we know that superior planets are always direct in motion when they are near the sun. Mars is following the order of the zodiac by secondary motion and moving direct from the 18th degree of Libra to the 19th degree of Libra. So Mars is slower than the sun. The sun is catching up with Mars, which means that Mars is actually setting under the beams. How about Mercury then? You'll see that Mercury is direct here. There is no red mark here saying that it's retrograde. And both Mercury and Venus are only about to turn retrograde when they reach a certain distance from the sun. We're talking about Mercury here, so we do need to check the ephemeris or our software program to see whether Mercury is picking up speed or not. And in this case, it is. What does that mean? It means that Mercury is going to move faster and faster in a counterclockwise direction through the zodiacal order, and it's eventually going to catch up with the sun. So Mercury is also about to set into the sunbeams. Neither Mars or Mercury are rising from the beams in this chart, even though Mars will be visible in the evening and Mercury will be visible in the morning. Here's a second example where our eye is drawn to Mercury and Venus now. The sun has almost reached 7 degrees of Capricorn, so Mercury is at a 16-degree distance from the sun, and Venus just 1 degree more. They're both on the left of the sun, which means that they will be both visible in the evening on the western horizon. But are they helically rising? Mercury is direct, but Venus is retrograde, as indicated by the red symbol there, which means that Venus is retracing its steps and it's actually moving backwards through the zodiac from the 24th to the 23rd degree of Capricorn, making its way to the sun rays. So Venus is in its helical setting phase, while Mercury is coming out of the beams. And in our third and last example, before we go on to the interpretation, here it looks like, this is a bit of an unfortunate picture because it looks like Sun and Mercury are closer to one another than they actually are. But if you look closely, you see that Mercury is at 16 degrees Gemini and the Sun at 29 degrees Gemini. So they're about 13 degrees apart. And as you can see here from the red RX symbol, Mercury is retrograde, moving back to the 15th degree while the sun is moving forwards toward the next sign of Cancer. And this means that Mercury is about to make its helical rising. And since it's on the right side of the sun, Mercury will have its first appearance in the morning just before sunrise. And finally, we made it to the interpretation of these helically rising planets. And I like to start off with some general significations first. So generally, we can think of a planet that is making a helical rising as a planet that is calling attention to itself. It's an appearance that speaks. It has returned from a place that we can't see, and now it has come back, drawing our attention like it has something really important to say. And Bonatti says that a planet rising from the sun in either the east or the west is like a warrior coming out of a battle victorious. Al-Biruni says that a helically rising planet is a planet recovering from a sickness and being restored to health. And Joseph Crane adds that the planet's condition of helical rising may compensate even for other difficulties, such as being in its sign of detriment, such as Jupiter in Gemini, for example. Jupiter is in its detriment in Gemini, but if Jupiter is coming out from under the beams of the sun in a chart, this may actually compensate a little for being in detriment. And for interpretive purposes, Joseph Crane also considers a helical rising planet as if it were in the first or the 10th house, which means that its significations will be amplified, like any planets that are in the first or the 10th house. So what it means is that a planet will speak louder in the chart. And Hephaestus states that all the stars rejoice when they are at their rising, just as each is exalted in its own rulerships. Being on the rise, as it were, unto their youth, being quite powerful, they accomplish all things for men. That is really promising. Abu Mashar says the stars, when they become morning and go out of the sunlight, they show clearly their operations and they have great force. So in general, I think we can say that there seems to be a raw force in these reborn planets, and they're putting forth their basic significations in a very powerful way. The planet becomes more prominent in the chart, and its significations will permeate and saturate the native's entire life. And of course, any further refinement of our interpretation will depend upon the specific planet. And we have to keep in mind that the planet that is coming out from under the rays of the sun has just been burned by the hot sunbeams. And it is not in the best shape it can be. Especially Venus, burned by the sunbeams, is very weakened. And for example, a person who has Venus as the ascendant ruler, and Venus is combust, or that is within 8 degrees of the sun rays, so heavily burned, that could be someone who gives up more easily. And in worst case scenario, people that are more desperate. So in our interpretation, we can think about how every planet would behave when they are put in challenging circumstances. Abu Mashar says this beautifully in his Libri Mysteriorium, that when Mars gets free of the sun, it is similar to a sharp and infallible blade, and the wound caused by it is incurable. So that is like a core raw signification of Mars, you could say. And when Saturn goes out of the sunbeams, it is like a lion which throws itself out of its den and kills whoever it meets. But when Jupiter gets free of the rays of the sunlight, it is like a man who loves justice, who is honest, and who got free from any bond, a reason for which he or she becomes mild and well disposed towards everything, kind and merciful. When Venus is free from the sunbeams, it is like a woman being already subjected to needs and to torments and to diseases, recovers health. And when Mercury goes out of the rays, if in that moment it puts itself near a benevolent star or is configured to it, it means a good thing. But if it's conjunct to a malevolent star, it means a serious offense. Mercury can go both ways, as usual. And we get a good idea here of a young or rejuvenated planet showing off its most essential significations. And it looks like the planets that come out of the beams are pure and innocent in a sense, and untarnished or uncorrupted by experience. So we can think of a planet in its most archetypal sense. When we see a planet in the chart that just became a morning or an evening star, we have to consider the essential and archetypal significations of that planet first and really try to think of it in its purest form. Let's take it a step further now. We know that both Mercury and Venus can have first visibility on both the eastern horizon as on the western horizon. And if we contemplate for a minute the experience of watching a planet reappear on the horizon, there is definitely a difference between east and west. The eastern horizon is also the place where the superior planets have first visibility. So we could stick to Abu Mashar's interpretation of the reborn or rejuvenated planet, as it is the sun who actively catches up with the planet, as if the planet is old, slow, and dying. And when the sun connects with the planet, it revitalizes that planet. Because that's essentially what the sun does. The sun gives life, right? Light and life is everywhere the sun goes. And I think the directions are key here. A lot of emphasis is placed on the 4 directions in the magical traditions. And it is true that each direction, east, south, west, north, is experienced very differently. There is a completely different feel to it. The east is the direction in which new days are always starting, right? So it's the place of new beginnings, the place of birth is where the ascendant is, the place of birth. Planets in the east, like the beginning of a new day, are young. Think about the first house in the natal chart. The first house is our body that has been born into this world. It's a new beginning, a new life. Or think of an event chart. The ascendant in the east marks the beginning of that event. Now, the planets that reappear on the western horizon are much more mysterious. Why is that? Because they become visible in a place where the sun sets and becomes invisible every day. So the sun always sets in the 7th house, and that is precisely why ancient astrologers saw the 7th house, not the 8th, as the house of death. It is a place where the sun, the ultimate giver of life, disappears into the underworld. Now just think about the symbolism of Mercury and Venus being able to reappear, re-emerge from the sunbeams right in the place of death. They ascend from the underworld. And to me, this phenomenon is the origin of the message that has been given to us through most spiritual traditions, that there is life after death, and not only life after death. Venus rising in the West speaks to the message that love conquers everything. Love is the main signification of Venus, and the mind can conquer death, love can conquer death. So Mercury, Hermes, is also ascending from the underworld by rising in the West. The mind can conquer death. The hermeneutic mind, that is, or the art of interpretation, on the one hand, and on the other hand, beauty and truth, Venus. Truth was beauty, according to the Greeks. And Venus is, of course, love and loving devotion. And those are the 2 paths of wisdom in so many mystical traditions. And how does the moon fit into this scheme? Well, the moon, the new moon, also has its first appearance on the western horizon. It is a new beginning, but a little different than the slower planets that appear in the east. The moon is understood to be a translator of light. The moon clearly shows that it's reflecting sunlight, and it is thought of as doing this reflecting of the light for all the celestial bodies. So the moon translates the light to our realm here in the material world. The moon is, you could say, nourishing us with the sun's light while the sun is in the underworld. So by rising in the west just after sunset, the moon bears a message for us. Is the message that the sun is not really gone and that there is life after death. The sun, or the spirit, is eternal. And even if we can't see it in this sublunar realm, in this life, in these bodies, the moon is always reminding us of the eternal light by reflecting it to us when the source of our light is no longer visible. And this is how the moon comforts us in that sense. There is something else I want to mention here. I have been wondering for a long time about the gender of the planets, because most of the ancient texts define Saturn Jupiter, Mars, and the Sun as the masculine planets, while Venus and the Moon are the feminine planets, right? And Mercury can, of course, be both masculine and feminine. Well, now, if you emphasize the importance of the cardinal directions and the first appearance, the place of the first appearance, first visibility, it makes total sense. Because the masculine planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and the Sun, all rise to visibility in the east. On one side, they rise. One, the masculine number, right? So the Sun goes to the right, and the Moon, who has first visibility in the west, moves to the left. Left is feminine and right is masculine. You see that everywhere. And the Sun and the Moon are the most obvious archetypes of the masculine and the feminine, or the yang and the yin. And then Mercury and Venus can be both. And the number 2, by the way, is a feminine number. They are fast and direct when they rise in the west. Very powerful omen. Now, let's see how we can translate all of this into a meaningful interpretation of a planet in a chart. So Mercury is the planet that goes in and out of the sunbeams all the time. Mercury is a planet of change. Mercury goes retrograde 3 times this year. In 2021, Mercury will have 6 helical rising phases, 3 direct ones and 3 retrograde ones. So we can say that Mercury is used to traveling to the underworld, and being under the sunbeams doesn't seem to harm Mercury as much as it does the other planets. And Abu Mashar even says that when Mercury, which bears combustion, which means if Mercury becomes burned under the rays of the sun, it is similar to a man accustomed to difficulties and to miseries and poverty, and who bears such things since they are familiar to him. So Mercury is used to it. And about Mercury's retrograde motion, he says that Mercury is also distressed when it recedes, when it is retrograde, since it gets burned as well. But it is not offended by its receding and by the fact that it is burned as much as Venus. And many of us have Mercury retrograde in the natal chart, right? So there are 2 different conditions. Mercury is either retrograde and having its first visibility on the eastern horizon, or it is direct with first visibility on the western horizon. And Mercury's position relative to the sun will determine which sect it belongs to, by the way. When Mercury is reborn on the eastern horizon, it belongs to the diurnal sect, or the daytime sect. It is reborn, but it appears to be standing still in the sky, and it appears as a flash just before sunrise. So Mercury is very, very intense in this phase. And as a newborn Mercury, it's going to be more impulsive and risk-taking, adventurous, youthful, enthusiastic, with an endless curiosity for anything that is new, and it shows itself in its purest form, uncorrupted by experience. There is always a sort of naivete in reborn planets. And when Mercury reappears for the first time on the western horizon after its lying hidden phase, it is fast and direct, and it escapes the descent into the underworld. So Mercury, you could say, has gained knowledge from the underworld, and then it resurrects, and it brings us messages of wisdom before it descends back into the underworld with the sun. And this could be seen as Mercury as the teacher, the sage. Mercury more in its function as organizing the information it has collected, assimilating and integrating the data. Mercury as an evening star is a little more deliberate in its thinking, more contemplating and bringing its wisdom to others. This is the Mercury who is a teacher and also a guardian of the mysteries. When Venus has its first appearance on the eastern horizon, it is always retrograde. And by the way, Venus stays retrograde for about 40 days. 40 days of wandering through the desert, right? These retrograde periods of Venus don't happen nearly as often as is the case with Mercury. They will happen about every 18 months. Like I said, Venus is not doing well in its retrograde motion, and Venus is much slower than it likes to be when it appears on the eastern horizon. And it's pretty beat up, so to speak, when coming out of the burning rays of the sun. So Venus's rebirth on the eastern horizon has a slow start, but it carries the promise that it will soon become brighter and brighter. And with the increasing reflected light just before sunrise, this is an incredibly powerful omen. And Venus is the only planet whose light is able to cast a shadow on our planet. So as the bringer of the newborn light on the eastern horizon, morning star Venus was called Phosphorus, which literally translates as the bringer of light. And so Venus, as the brightest non-luminary in the sky, announces the greater light, the sun that will soon rise. Venus is reborn in the east and is young and innocent. With the east being the place where all the young or masculine planets make their first reappearance, we can make a distinction between Venus as a morning star being more active, more outgoing and dynamic, and the Venus as a morning star can have a feeling of being compelled towards a certain goal or desire, or to ambitiously pursue that desire, or being self-indulgent and actively pursuing pleasure. While an evening star Venus, on the other hand, resurrects on the western horizon, would be a little more receptive, graceful, maybe with a more nuanced sensitivity for its environments and harmony in social life. And in general, an evening star Venus is seen as more oriented towards relationships with others. Yeah, now there is something very special about Venus. On rare occasions, Venus can actually be seen in both the morning and the evening on the same day. And this happens when Venus is at a distance of about 6 degrees or more to the ecliptic. The red line that you see here is the ecliptic, and that is the path of the sun. So you see the red line here going right through the sun, exactly in the middle. And the planets following, they all follow this path through the sky, but most of the time they're just a little above or a little below the ecliptic. But if Venus is far enough above the ecliptic, like you see here, it will still be visible because it is far enough above the rays of the sun. And remember, Venus is a very, very bright star. So Venus can escape the sunbeams in a vertical manner. So this retrograde Venus here, and this is in March 2025, is going to appear to be moving over the sun. And in some places, Venus will actually be visible in the morning as well as in the evening. I think I do have a slide like you see here. This is on the morning of March 18th, 2025. And you see Venus there above the horizon in the east. And then here, this is on the evening of that same day. And this is so amazing. And it must have been such an inspiring sight for ancient astrologers. It means that on some occasions, Venus does not go into the underworld. Venus escapes death, escapes the encounter with the sun, and lives on. And this phenomenon only happens during the months of February, March, and April, by the way, in the Northern Hemisphere, that is. And that is probably why Venus, who was known as Ishtara in Sumer and as Inanna in Babylon, Venus was so often portrayed as a warrior. And here in the photo on the left, you see how Ishtar is carrying weapons and she's subduing a lion. And I don't know if we should see the sun in the top left corner as the sun or as a star. I'm not sure, but the lion in any case, we could see as a symbol for the sun. And here it is under Ishtar's foot. So Ishtar is portrayed on the right of the sun or on the right of both the star and the lion, which suggests that this is a morning rising Venus. It's on the right. And remember that Venus is always retrograde when rising in the east. And, the only time that Venus can escape the rays of the sun vertically through its latitude is when Venus is retrograde. Venus really conquers death like a warrior. And I've included this this tarot card here on the right because I see the same mystical symbolism repeated in the Strength card, where we see a woman with a tamed lion and the symbol of infinity, the symbol of eternity right above her head. So Venus, love without beginning nor end. It is also the 8th card in the deck, and 8 is the number of years of Venus's cycle. Yeah, and this is why I love the Rider-Waite deck. It shows that they had the knowledge that was transmitted through the mystery schools. You could argue also that Venus is able to avoid death or avoid the end. And I think the avoidance is also something that could speak to the way that we sometimes understand Venus in our interpretation in the chart. Many times we see a Venusian person avoiding conflict and confrontation, or they like things to stay the same maybe, rather than having to go through a crisis. Or even if the end result would be to their own advantage, avoidance. Venus in its retrograde motion will experience these kind of crisis situations. I added these dates here. The last time that Venus was high enough in latitude to avoid the sunbeams was in March 2017, in the Northern Hemisphere, that is. And the next time will be in March 2025. And for the Southern Hemisphere, we always have to look for a negative latitude. So Venus has to be far enough under the ecliptic to become visible in the morning and the evening. Next time that will happen is around August 2023. So as for a brief summary, we could say that planets that have their first visibility in the east are reborn, and planets that re-emerge in the west are resurrected. And both Mercury and Venus are planets that connect things that are different, and they're always close to the sun, connecting spirit to the material world. Maybe some of you say, well, Jupiter also connects, and that's true, but Jupiter will connect things that are the same while Mercury and Venus connect things that are different. And that's why they can teach us so much. And as they appear to us in the sky from our perspective, they are always bound, closely connected to the sun, as they stay close to the sun at all times, right? Mercury connects through the mind in the sense of the hermeneutic process, while Venus connects through love and loving devotion. These are the two paths of enlightenment. Both Mercury and Venus have the capacity to illuminate us with the sun's light, with the light of spirit. And finally, I have a couple of natal charts that I'd like to show you. And here is the natal chart of Julie Prive. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. But Julie is someone who has won the lottery almost 20 years ago. She won $6 million in the lottery. And I'm focusing on Saturn here. Saturn has come out of the beams of the sun 6 days prior to birth. And as you can see, Venus is also moving away from the sun and is here at 18 degrees from the sun. But it was 10 days ago when Venus was at a 15-degree distance from the sun. So I'm not going to focus on Venus. I'm going to focus on Saturn here in the second house of finances. Why? Because Julie's life has literally been brought to visibility, very literally, through a story around money. It's like Saturn is coming out of the beams, waving at us and showing us that it has something to say about second house topics. Saturn is not very well placed here in Leo, which is the home of the sun. It is a sign of Saturn's detriment. So Saturn actually rules the 8th place, the place of other people's money. Well, as it turned out, Julie's lottery winnings were disputed. And an older couple, old age Saturn, an older couple in their 60s said that they were the rightful owners of the lottery ticket, and it all ended up in a lawsuit. And the background story of that is that Julie worked at a convenience store, and she said that she had found the winning ticket in a pile of discarded scratch tickets. The couple later admitted that they thought their ticket was a losing ticket, and they had handed it over to Julie. But during the trial, however, the jury was unable to reach a verdict, and both parties eventually had to agree on a settlement, or it would never have ended probably. So, and here's another chart example with Saturn as the planet that is coming out of the beams. And I found this chart to be interesting for many different reasons, actually. Saturn is in a weaker cadent house here, but still it is playing a pivotal role in the chart at several occasions. So I want to take some time, excuse me, I want to take some time to go around this chart to provide some background information. First, I want to look at which of these planets are speaking loudly in this chart, and that would be both Jupiter in the 7th and Mercury in the 4th house. They will be the busiest and loudest planets because they're in angular houses, the 7th and the 4th. So, and if we look closer, we notice that they are both in bad condition. So we have loud planets in bad shape. Jupiter is in its fall in Capricorn, and it has just turned direct again, only a day before Nancy's birth. So Jupiter is extremely slow and very intense. And this might be one of those cases where a benefic planet can become a functional malefic. Now, Mercury in the fourth is also loud and busy. And even though Mercury doesn't feel that bad in the sign of Libra, it is in a very intense phase of its synodic cycle right now because it is stationing retrograde and actually turning retrograde within the next 24 hours. So Mercury will make its way back under the beams of the sun. And this intense phase of stationing retrograde might indicate a significant setback, and that is exactly what it turned out to be. So Nancy was born to an upper middle class family. So the fourth house of roots and family is ruled by the benefic of the sect Venus, which is a very good planet. And Nancy's future looked very, very promising. She was a Sunday school teacher. She was a cheerleader, and she majored in English at Berkeley. And she married a musician who was working for a state employment office, which does fit the Jupiter and Saturn sign, Capricorn in the seventh house of relationships. But after 6 years, he left her, and he left what they call a love and hate relationship. And things went really downhill fast for Nancy, and she went through a period of serious drug abuse, and she worked as a topless blackjack dealer. She also started having a relationship with an inmate in a state prison who happened to become the leader of the SLA, which was an organization that is mostly remembered for committing bank robberies. And it's also famous for the kidnapping of Patty Hearst in the 70s. Now, Mercury is not only making a powerful superior square to Jupiter in the seventh, which makes Mercury pretty dominant. Mercury is also the ruler of the 12th house, where we would look for addiction as well as isolation or imprisonment. And in itself, this might not have been strong enough a testimony, but this Saturn right here that is coming out of the beams, the natural ruler of imprisonment, and ruler of the seventh house of lovers, seems to announce some of what has happened to Nancy's partner. And I see Saturn here as a second testimony for her getting involved with a prisoner. And a third testimony is the contra-antition between Mercury and Saturn, by the way. Mercury rules Saturn, but it is in an aversion to its own house. But as Saturn is in a contra-antitia here with Mercury, there is a secretive connection between the two planets. This Saturn doesn't only speak to Nancy's partner, though. By November 1973, members of the SLA had murdered someone, and Nancy was scared to get caught if anyone would find out that she was a member of the SLA. And she was almost caught by a really strange turn of events. Because days after the murder in November 73, a serial rapist who had no ties whatsoever with the SLA tried to assault Nancy at the front door of her house. I thought that was amazing. In the third house, Saturn in the third house, and that's a house of neighbors. And she was assaulted at her front door. And she was able to stop the assault, but the neighbors had warned the police. So keep in mind that Saturn is becoming visible in the third house of, among other things, the neighborhood, as the third place in the chart is right next to the fourth place of the home and house. So she was assaulted right in front of her home. And now the police were coming to investigate the confrontation with a serial rapist. And Nancy had all sorts of weapons and plenty of evidence that would connect her to the SLA in her house. But she managed to keep the police from coming into her house, and she was able to give a statement to the police right there on her front lawn, almost exposed in that third house. Now, not very long after, in May of the next year, Nancy got killed during a shootout with the police. SLA members were hiding in a house, and Nancy crawled out of the house and was shot in front of the house. She was exposed right outside of the house in the third place in the natal chart, and she was shot twice. Saturn in Virgo, a double-bodied sign. And you see Saturn ruling the 8th house of death. And next example. Alexander Graham Bell was, of course, an inventor and is mostly known for patenting the first telephone communication. So we see Mercury here at 12 degrees from the sun, making its way out of the beams. And Mercury is already or will soon be visible on the western horizon. And even though Mercury is in its joy in the first house, it is not in great shape, right? It is out of sect because it's of the evening in a daytime chart. And it's in Pisces, which is the sign of its detriment and its fall. And it is co-present with the malefic, contrary to the sect in favor, Saturn. Not in good shape. It's also ruled by a Jupiter that is in its detriment. So that's all looking pretty bleak so far, and yet Bell was very successful. How can that be? Well, how about the power of an evening star Mercury? First of all, I need to point out that there is a helpful mutual reception between Mercury and Jupiter at play here, because you see that Mercury is in Jupiter's sign and Jupiter is in Mercury's sign. And this will mitigate the condition of both of these planets just a little bit. But I do think that Mercury's helical rising phase and the first visibility on the western horizon will tell the story. So do you see this applying opposition there between the moon and Mercury? It is about to perfect. And the moon is the natural significator of the mother, while Mercury signifies communication. They oppose each other. And as it turns out, when Bell was 12 years old, his mother was gradually becoming deaf. And Bell was deeply affected by that. And he learned a manual finger language so he could have silent conversations with her. And he also developed a technique of speaking in clear modulated tones so that his mother was still being able to understand him. So can you see what Bell is really doing here? He is overcoming challenges. He is conquering the death of his mother's hearing. And this preoccupation with his mother's deafness eventually led him to study acoustics, led him to experiment with sound and invent new technologies and ways to communicate with deaf people. And in other words, his whole life was centered around mercurial themes, and Mercury saturated his life, basically. All right. Next up is the chart of Jurgen Habermas, who is a famous German philosopher and teacher. And in contrast to Alexander Bell's evening star Mercury, Jurgen has a morning star Mercury, and you see it is setting here at the ascendant right before sunset. So Mercury will rise the next morning before the sun, and Mercury is pretty intense here. It's about to station direct only 2 days after his birth. And Jupiter has had its helical rising phase just 2 weeks prior to birth. And since it's co-present here with Mercury, and it is also the ruler of the first house, its signification is going to be very important in this chart. They're also in the 7th house, very loud planets. Well, so Mercury is here in its own domicile Gemini, while Jupiter is in its detriment or exile, as it is opposing its own sign Sagittarius here in the first house. Well, Mercury is in much better shape than Jupiter is. I looked up his biography on Wikipedia, and the second sentence, well, the first sentence is he was born then and there, and he's a philosopher, da da da. And the second sentence is, and you can't make this up, it says, his work addresses communicative rationality and the public sphere. In other words, his work addresses mercurial and Jupiterian things. And a closer look at his philosophy is also interesting, by the way. It says that Habermas considers his major contribution to be the development of the theory of communicative reason, which locates rationality in structures of interpersonal linguistic communication, Mercury, rather than in the structure of the cosmos, Jupiter. So here you see very literally that Mercury gets the upper hand and Jupiter is the one who has to fold, so to speak. Mercury in its own domicile versus Jupiter in its detriment. Mercury wins. And seeing the philosophy and the philosopher's chart is something I really love to do. By the way, it really puts things into perspective, and it shows you how subjective theories and ideologies really are. Anyway. Oh yeah, this is Marvin Leonard Goldberger. He was a scientist. Oh yeah, and I totally nerded out on this example, right? Anyway, I thought it was funny, so I included it here. Here we see that the ascendant ruler Mercury is retrograde, and it is applying to a conjunction with Saturn. And Saturn has just made its helical rising, and Mercury is about to. It's now at 15 degrees away from the sun. So both Saturn and Mercury would have been visible on the eastern horizon in the morning of his birth, basically screaming that a scientist has been born. And Saturn is the malefic contrary to the sect in favor, but it is exalted in Libra and it is in the place of good fortune. I don't know much about his personal life, and it is his work that has been brought to visibility. So I felt compelled to dig into this and into his achievements as a scientist. And apparently he introduced a theory that is called crossing symmetry. Crossing symmetry, how does that sound for a Mercury about to conjoin and then cross Saturn in Libra, the sign of symmetry? And that's not all. This theory is a quantum physics theory, and Goldberger's theory in particular stated that antiparticles are particles that go backwards in time, Saturn's time and Mercury going backwards. So yeah, I nerded out, but I thought it was pretty cool. Oh, and this is our last, just a last example. Here we have Patty Wagstaff's chart, and I think this is a good example of a retrograde Venus that is rising from the sunbeams. And Venus here is going to have first visibility on the eastern horizon. And this will happen in less than 2 days after her birth. So Mercury, who is in its own domicile and exaltation here in Virgo, is in direct motion and is moving in a counterclockwise direction towards Venus. So they're pretty close. And in this example, we have to see a blending of these two planets in her life story. Well, Patty is an aerobatic pilot. Venus is ruling her 10th house with an exalted Saturn, as you can see there, present in air sign Libra. And Patty stands out as a top winner of plenty of championships for many, many years in a row. She's an air show pilot and a stunt pilot for movies. So now we can see the combination of Venus and Mercury, the acrobatics or aerobatics, I should say, and yet her story definitely carries the signature of Venus as a morning star warrior type, because she decided to become a pilot after her first flight in a small airplane ended in a crash. So I said that Venus was in its fall in Virgo. So she had a crash. And then instead of developing a fear of flying or something after that crash, she decided to take control. And to me, this really sounded like the goddess Ishtar, the warrior, escaping death. Even though Venus on this day was only visible in the morning and not in the evening. Sounds like a warrior to me. Okay, and with this, this was the last example, I think. Yes, it is. So here's where I end this presentation, and I'm ready to take any questions now, if any of you have questions.
Thank you, Michelle. Some have already come into the chat box. If anybody wants to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A box. We will do, we'll see how many we have time for. Michelle, are you able to see the questions?
Do I look at the Q&A box?
Yes, you just click there.
Okay, yeah.
All of them should come up. Okay, and I would just ask that you please just read the question out loud for those who are watching the playback as well. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just looking. Oh, and I'm sorry, everyone. I see that there was a chat box too. And I'm sorry for not having seen that people were saying things in the chat box. But you can type in your questions in the Q&A box, yeah. Brenda asks, Chuda was talking about an auspicious aspect called a Cassimi when a planet is around 1 degree before or after the sun. He called the conjunction as being in the heart of the sun and the gift that comes from that. Do you see the burning up as the coming in and leaving, and a transformational aspect to the conjunction? Well, it is. Thank you, Brenda, for your question. And yeah, it being at the heart of the sun, I didn't really speak about that today because I was focusing on the first appearance of the planets. But it is an important moment. It is a moment of the planet being by the throne, really, of the sun, of the king. Being at the heart of the sun is being on the throne of the king, really. And it's a moment, it's a very, very powerful moment where the planet is protected from the rays of the sun. So yeah, and there's sure much to say about it being transformational or not. But thank you for your question. Spencer, hi Spencer, Spencer Michaud. Would you say that Hermes is in the underworld as psychopomp every time it's under the beams, including direct? It is something that has always puzzled me. Some astrologers say that it is only retrograde and perhaps direct invisibility is Hermes visiting Olympus. Oh, that's interesting. What are your thoughts? Perhaps visiting Olympus could be at the greatest elongation. Oh, these are wonderful questions, Spencer. Oh yeah, it's, this research is endless, and I've been researching until today, and today I found this wonderful paper about visibility, and there's no end to it, but these are such, this is giving me more inspiration, Spencer. What I wanted to go to again today is really try and experience what is visible again. And starting from that pure moment when the sky is basically talking to you, you know what I mean? And then you can read the stories afterwards and read about Hermes as the psychopomp, delivering messages from the underworld and guiding souls as a psychopomp, guiding the souls to the underworld. After the experience, these stories make more sense to me. So I'm going to look into that, Spencer. Thank you for your question. Oh yeah, and you also asked, would you consider the superior conjunction or inferior planets a full moon or some other new beginning? Yeah, that's really interesting. So you have there is some debate about where the planetary cycle starts. Does it start with the superior conjunction when the planet is direct, or does it start with the inferior conjunction when the planet is retrograde? And a lot of astrologers say, well, it has to be superior conjunction because that is when the planet is direct, and so it's stronger, because the inferior conjunction, if planet is retrograde, it's always weakened. And I was puzzled by that. But Demetra George always said that it starts with the inferior planets, the inferior conjunction. And that is the new moon phase. I think so. It's just out of the top of my head. But it kind of makes sense if you take into account the cardinal directions. Then you're going to have to see Venus and Mercury rising in the east would mean the east would be new beginning. So in their inferior conjunction there with the sun, there could be the new moon phase, so to speak, or there could be the new beginning. It could, it could start there. So the jury's out on it still, but okay. Thank you, Spencer. Great questions.
Hey, Michelle, I wonder if we could pause the screen sharing while you're answering questions so that we can have
Yeah,
more of
sure.
you. Thank you.
Sure. I don't know if that's a good idea, but sure. I felt so good in the small thumbnail. Bruno, sorry if I didn't understand it well, but is it okay to consider 16 degrees and also the sun being in a different sign than Mercury, for example? Oh, yes. So the signs, yeah, so it's just we just have to look if the planet is visible or not. So this is across sign boundaries. Yeah, Mercury and the sun can be in different signs. And 16 degrees, yes, if it speaks to you, then please consider, it's still going to be morning stars or evening stars are always going to be prominent in a chart, you know. So yeah, do consider that planet within 16 degrees. An anonymous attendee says, so I'm a little bit confused because in my chart, both Mercury and Venus are morning stars, but for both the description for evening star fits me perfectly, but morning star not at all. Any thoughts about what might influence this? Could it be because my Mercury is newly direct, Venus conjunct South Node, night chart with Cancer moon in the first? Oh yeah, sure. It could be a lot of things, and we would have to look at the specific chart to figure out what's going on. And also, like I said, it's also really important to actually check where the planets are going. Are they slowing down? Are they about to go faster? So we would have, but these are just some refinements I gave. And of course, you have to look at the whole of the chart because things and people are walking contradictions. So things in the chart will contradict each other. We will have to take the whole chart into consideration. Thank you for your question. Brenda asks oh, it skipped. Oh yeah. Brenda asks, in Nancy Ling Perry's chart, if we are in the center of the chart looking at the sun, isn't Saturn on the right of the sun? And did you not say that would be moving toward the sun, not coming out of the sun? Did I misspeak, or did I had the slide wrong? I have to check. So I am seeing, if we stand in the middle of the chart, in the center of the chart, and we look at the sun, Saturn was on the right side of the sun in Nancy's chart. I probably misspoke. Oh, and did you not say that it would be moving toward the sun, not coming out of? No, because if Saturn is on the right side of the sun, the planets are always moving in a counterclockwise direction. So Saturn is direct, the sun is also direct, and the sun is faster than Saturn. So the sun is in an earlier degree of Virgo in Nancy Ling Perry's chart. Brian asks something. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you, Brian. Does returning to visibility apply to progressions? Yes. Please check if one of your planets is returning to visibility in the progress charts. Yeah, thank you. Does visibility, Soturo, does visibility only concern planets, or does visibility also apply to north and south nodes? If so, how? Well, that's a really good question. It doesn't apply to north and south nodes because the nodes are mathematical points in the sky where the moon where the path of the moon intersects with the ecliptic. And so they're just points and they don't give light. And this is the visibility is important, right? So they won't be visible in the sky. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Michelle. We're closing in on 2 hours now. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, and I just want to be able to direct people to where they can find the replay and catch the other talks. So thank you so much for an amazing presentation, and I'll come back to you in just one
Okay, thank you.
second. Okay, so the website should be on the screen again. Can you? Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah, it's there. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. Okay, so I hope everyone has enjoyed this talk. I can say personally, I've greatly enjoyed and found it very informative and fascinating. And so once again, if you go to nightlightastrology.com, you go to the events page, speaker series. There, beginning tomorrow, this button that says register here will be a replay link, and the replay will be available for 7 days. And then while you're here, if you haven't signed up yet to attend for your live link for the rest of the speaker series, next weekend we have Martine Hermes on Saturday and Kat Nelligan on Sunday. And once again, if you are a student, an active student in one of the Nightlight courses, you will have these, you will receive this talk in your Dropbox beginning tomorrow. And that's it. Thank you, Michelle. I have
Thank
been
you.
looking at the chat box and the feedback has been absolutely wonderful.
Oh, thank you all for joining me here today. Thank you.
So big thank you to Michelle. Big thank you to everybody who has been in attendance, and we hope to see you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.